So this thing here, the brain, the human brain, is probably the most complicated, the most majestic thing in the known universe. The very fact that we're thinking about the brain is, in reality, the neurons itself, the brain, thinking about the brain. So it's thinking about itself. And the idea that this brain, for example, can create a thought or an idea and then direct action from it is also quite astounding. So if, for example, my brain thought, oh, I should flex my muscle or move my hand, that actually happens. A thought actually moves matter. In this video, what we're going to talk about is the nervous system, the neuron, and how sensory information or thoughts can actually result in physical matter moving. Let's get started. So why do animals need a nervous system? As you'll see right here, right, oh, if a big bird came after the bunny, it needs to run away, right? So we need a nervous system to coordinate actions, process sensory information. That rabbit saw the bird coming, and it needed to be fast and accurate in its response so that it could run away and escape the predator. On the other hand, the bird needed to also be able to coordinate actions, process that sensory information when it saw the rabbit, and move quickly. So we need a nervous system that's fast, accurate, and then at the end we need it to be able to reset quickly to move on to the next task. So let's talk about the overview of the nervous system. When you say nervous system, most people think of the central nervous system, right? The brain and the spinal cord. Although there is also the peripheral nervous system. That's a little more complicated. People don't think about that as much, but you have the central, right, the brain and the spinal cord. Most people think of that, brain, spinal cord. But you also have all these nerves on the periphery, if you will. They're important as well. You've got motor neurons and sensory neurons. So let's start with the brain and the spinal cord. You think about those. Of course, the brain, it's all in a lot of processes in the body, memories, emotions, all of that fun stuff. Spinal cord, if you think about that, its main job is coordinating the signals from all parts of the body to and from the brain. So that's central. If you go over to peripheral, what you see is we have two main types, the motor neurons and the sensory. So if you think motor movement, right? So this is from the central nervous system to some muscles or glands that we want to do something. Motor neurons, movement, do something, some action. The other, of course, would be the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons are the things we sense. If you smell, if you see, if you taste, those senses need to be relayed to the central nervous system. So the sensory organs actually go to the central nervous system so it can coordinate and then perhaps maybe send a message back down the motor neurons. Now, if you break the motor neurons down into their two parts, you've got the autonomic and the somatic. So if you take autonomic and break that down, that's all about controlling involuntary response. So it's autonomic, but you can also think sort of automatic. This just happens automatically. It's involuntary. We don't think about it. So your heart beating. You don't have to sit around and think, oh, heart beat now, right? It's part of the nervous system response. It's involuntary. Thank goodness we don't have to think about it. That's divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So if you think of involuntary responses, the sympathetic is all about fight or flight. If you see a snake or something, or you feel like you're in danger, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. You're filled with adrenaline, epinephrine, and your body needs to decide, am I fighting or am I fleeing? Okay. Well, the converse of that is parasympathetic. Okay, maybe that wasn't a snake. It was just like a little garden hose or something. Oh, I need to calm down. I need to rest. I need to digest. So the parasympathetic nervous system will help you rest and digest. So the other part we didn't talk about was somatic. These are voluntary responses. So that's the body movement. That's the muscular system moving parts of your muscles responding with your body. Okay, so there's the overview of the nervous system. Two big parts, central and peripheral. And then peripheral breaks down into many different types. So let's talk about the cell. The nervous system cell is called a neuron, right? It's about as basic as it gets, a nerve cell. Now, the neuron has many different parts. So the parts that receive information are called the dendrites. So you can see here all these little fingers that kind of receive information. Then it travels through the cell body down this long axon. Axon, think moving away. And then it gets to the end, and there's a space at the end called the synapse, or the synaptic space. That's the little space between the next neuron or perhaps some muscle, something that needs to be activated. So if you think about the direction, right? The dendrite receives, it goes to the cell body, and then the axon sends the signal away. So this is a great example of structure meeting function. You can see the structure of it allows for the function. So what's the function? Transmission of a signal. What's the structure? Well, it's got all these little fingers, these dendrites that receive the signal and then send it down one long pathway to get out. So if we look a little more closely at this axon, we notice, all right, so here's the axon. We notice that it's coated with some Schwann cells. So if you look here, all of these cells, right, are Schwann cells. So there's one there that you can see. Those Schwann cells make up something we call the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is sort of like a protective, insulating mechanism for the axon. I like to think of this as like an extension cord, right? You plug it in, you get some power. The electrons, the electron flow goes down the wire to whatever device you plugged in. But it's coated in this kind of rubbery material. That has a few functions if you think about it. One, it keeps the signal moving down the metal inside, but it also protects it from leaving or leaking out. If you were to take your hand and touch a live wire, right, let's say this plastic was off in a certain area, that rubber was off, and you touch the live wire, the electrons would flow out, the electricity would zap you. But because it's insulated, you keep the signal, you keep the flow moving down. Well, the same thing is kind of going on here. Because this axon is insulated, it speeds the signal and keeps it from sort of going off in all directions to other nearby neurons. So this myelin sheath is very important. So the Schwann cells collectively together make up this myelin sheath that you see there, and it actually speeds the signal up to about 330 miles per hour versus if we don't have the myelin sheath, it's roughly 11. A few interesting points. As with most things in the body, something can go wrong with it. Occasionally, the immune system attacks these specific Schwann cells, right? We have these T cells in our body that we learned about in a previous video. They actually attack the immune system if you have this sort of autoimmune disease. And when it attacks the myelin sheath, it starts to break down, and therefore the signal can get lost. This condition is called multiple sclerosis. This one is kind of an easy one to remember because MS, multiple sclerosis, attacks the myelin sheath. Some interesting information about this that's come out pretty recently is many scientists have predicted, or they have shown in some studies, that this is actually caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, Epstein-Barr, which you've probably heard of as mono. So there's some ideas right now that this virus, having a bad case of this virus, actually can lend itself to developing multiple sclerosis later in life, right? Pretty scary that viruses, something like mono, could actually have such a drastic effect on our nervous system. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the types of neurons. I've already mentioned sensory neurons, right? So if I see something, if I smell something, there are some sensory neurons. The dendrites receive that information that are attached to the special sense organs, send it down right through the cell body, down the axon there, into some what we call interneurons. If you think of inter, that means between. So you have a sensory neuron that senses, and then you have all these interneurons, right? And we may go up to the brain for processing. We may just go to the spinal cord. After the brain or the spinal cord has decided what to do, we may need to activate a motor neuron. So a motor neuron sends the signal, of course, down the long axon. These all have axons. I've just labeled it there. And then the motor neuron will need to go to something to get some result, whether it's a gland or a muscle. In this case, I'm saying that we're going to activate and start running. So maybe you see something dangerous, right? You sense something dangerous. Senses send it to the brain, to the spinal cord. Interneurons are going to then send it back down the motor. Motor neurons move these leg muscles, get out of this situation. So these neurons work together. And this is a pretty simplistic overview. There's actually a lot more complicated things going on here. But this is kind of a general idea of how this works. You sense, we go to some interneurons, and then we send a signal back down the motor neuron to get some results, some action. So what happens when we get to the end of the neuron? Okay, so this is called the chemical synapse. So if you think about a neuron, all right, so here's the axon. Remember, that carries things away. So here's our axon. At the end of it, there's a few things that can happen. It can activate another neuron, which you see down here, or maybe it can activate a muscle. In this case, we're just going to look at it as another neuron, so one neuron carrying down another. Now, the interesting thing to note is that the signal that moves down a neuron is electrical. So when this axon terminal receives an action potential, right? And we'll learn all about action potential in the next video. When the neuron receives this action potential, this electrical impulse, some things start happening. So the action potential arrives at the presynaptic axon terminal. See, if this is the synapse, this space, the one before would be the presynaptic terminal. All right, so we've got the presynaptic terminal up here, receives the action potential. Once that happens, this voltage opens up this calcium channel, and it allows calcium ions to move into the presynaptic axon terminal. When that happens, these things called neurotransmitters, these little red dots here, these neurotransmitters are in their little vesicles, right? So we call these synaptic vesicles. Those neurotransmitters then, this vesicle binds to the membrane and releases those neurotransmitters into the synaptic space. So once these neurotransmitters are in this space, they then will go across to the postsynaptic neuron, right? This is the post. Let me write that in there for you. And will bind to some receptor proteins. Now, there's a few different receptor protein mechanisms. The one I'm showing you is an ion-gated. So the neurotransmitter comes across, it binds here to these ion-gated receptor proteins. Notice that they now open the gate and the ions can go through. Then we can send the signal right down this neuron. So this is going from one neuron to another, or going from one neuron to a muscle. This is what happens in the space, okay? So what we've done here is we've gone from an electrical signal up here to a chemical signal here in the synapse controlled by these neurotransmitters. Now, what happens to the neurotransmitters once they've gone over and binded to the receptor proteins? Well, they either need to be degraded or reabsorbed. So these neurotransmitters might be reabsorbed back into these synaptic vesicles for the next time that this whole process needs to happen. Okay, so this is pretty complicated, but bottom line, think we had an electrical signal that stimulates a chemical signal to move the signal across to another neuron or to perhaps a muscle or gland. Now, at the very beginning, I talked about, isn't this amazing that the brain can think a thought and then get muscles to move? Here's a point where that happens. We've thought a thought, it's moved down the neurons, and then it's gone across. In this case, it's a neuron, but this could also be a muscle, right? And if it was a muscle, it would send a particular neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, we'll talk about next, which would activate that muscle to move, to actually contract, and you'd get some movement. So speaking of these neurotransmitters, so these are the chemical messengers. When you think of neurotransmitter, right, you see neuro, right? So these are involving the nervous system, and they're transmitting information. And there's a few different types. I want to start with acetylcholine. This is a pretty simple one because acetylcholine is the one that is involved in muscle contraction. So acetylcholine is what's transmitted to that skeletal muscle to say, contract muscle. Okay? So if my brain wants to get my arm to move, it will send signal through my nervous system, but at the end of that, where it's touching the muscle, I need to have acetylcholine go across and actually activate that skeletal muscle. Okay? So then we have epinephrine and norepinephrine. You may know epinephrine is adrenaline, right, from the adrenal gland. It's what you think of in this fight or flight response. I gave you the example of, oh, is that a snake on the ground? Oh, my body needs to either fight it or flee. In my case, I'm probably going to flee. I don't like snakes. But you don't know. You might have to fight it. So epinephrine, norepinephrine are involved in that fight or flight response. Then we move on to dopamine, which is one of my favorites. It's involved in the reward center. So things that you do that give you a reward, all right, like eating, sex, drug addiction, right? I'm not condoning drug addiction, but that's how these drugs can really affect people because they release a bit of dopamine so that your body will react. So dopamine, sleep, mood, attention, learning. We also have another big name, serotonin, you've probably heard about. Serotonin is often associated with depression. And so a lot of people call this the happy neurotransmitter if you have a lot of it. This also affects sleep, mood, attention, and learning. Over here, I have this particular Venn diagram because a lot of people like to compartmentalize these neurotransmitters and say dopamine is only reward, serotonin is only happy. But what we really know is that it's really a combination of all of these that affect our mood, our balance, our attention. So you can't just necessarily, if someone has a chemical imbalance, meaning some of these are out of whack in the body, right? It could be genetic, it could be something psychological. A lot of people say, well, let's just take one drug. What if we could just take some serotonin or something? Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? Because many of these things, like mood, for example, look at how many different neurotransmitters affect your mood. So the idea of neurotransmitters being an easy fix to some of our problems is really not realistic. And what I want to talk about, what sort of end the video, is that neurotransmitters, it's actually kind of a weak point of the nervous system. The electrical signal generally goes pretty good, right? Unless, of course, you have MS and we have that myelin sheath issue. But the electrical part's generally pretty good in the body. A really weak point, though, of our nervous system are these neurotransmitters, because any substance, and we put a lot of substances in our body, that either affects them or mimics them can affect your nerve function. And one example I want to give you is something called SSRIs. That stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And basically, you may have heard of SSRIs because these are prescribed for people that may have depression, sometimes generalized anxiety disorder. And what SSRIs do is they essentially block the serotonin from being reuptaken into the presynaptic vesicle. So here, what I've shown you is where a lot of this serotonin is stored and made, and then how it sort of moves throughout the entire brain, right? You can see serotonin is widespread throughout the brain. So if someone has a condition like depression or some kinds of anxiety, a doctor might prescribe them an SSRI. What that's going to do is it's going to keep serotonin in this synaptic space more and hopefully binding to these receptors to continue the signal. So it keeps the serotonin from going back in it keeps it more in the space. So the idea is that it will continue to bind. So SSRIs it's one class of drugs that we now use to target when there's a neurotransmitter problem. But neurotransmitters go beyond just sort of our mental health issues, right? A lot of poisons, a lot of toxins are affecting neurotransmitters as well, and that can lead to lots of problems in the nervous system. Okay, so hopefully this was a good introduction to you to the nervous system and the neuron. In the next video, we'll talk specifically about that electrical signal, how that signal is transduced and moves through the neuron, and then ultimately we'll end up in the next video talking about the brain and a little more detail about neuroscience.